Slovenian architecture with confidence and self-respect. But of course, it's much more than that. And for that reason, we have invited the friends of the Faculty of Architecture, University of Ljubljana, to share their insights, their personal thoughts and experiences which they had with Plečnik's work. We have carefully selected our today's speakers based on diversity, and I'm sure we'll see Plečnik from various, very different angles. So for that reason, as the Dean of this faculty, it is really my great honor to welcome here tonight Andreas, Jonathan Sergison, and Ákos Moravánszky, and of course tomorrow Kengo Kuma. But I will give this microphone now to Professor Vasa Perovic, the Vice Dean of the faculty, to properly introduce each of tonight's speakers. Thank you again for your presence, and I'm sure we will all enjoy tonight's event.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. I think I have this duty, or I don't know if it's an honor, because I'm normally very quick. We have selected one architectural critic or publicist, one architect, Jonathan, and one architectural historian who have basically already maybe either dealt with the work of Plečnik, or somehow we think that their work relates in a way to kind of history in a way that a lot of Plečnik work does. So, and I'm sure that we are in for an interesting series of talks. Anyway, the first preacher, the first talk is by Andreas, who I think quite a few of you already know, because we've been seeing Andreas around here for quite a few times in the last 20 odd years. He is an architectural publicist, he's also an architectural publisher, he's an architectural critic, he runs the, he has done quite a few exhibitions and wrote some books. I remember the seminal text on, in my opinion, of course, on Lacaton Vassal in 2G, but also he has been running the Swiss Architecture Museum for the past too many years. Yes, yes. He has already contributed once to an event organized by Bostian, who is somewhere here, some years ago on the thoughts of Plečnik, in the humor in Plečnik's work, if I remember well, or something. The humor, yeah. But today, it's good that the title of his lecture is written here, because then I can also say it. The title of his lecture today is Jože Plečnik and the Architecture of the Eternal Return. So, Andreas, the floor or the pulpit is yours. This stays with you, no?
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in this space and in this architectural school and in this city. It's a city that I encountered for the first time in 1996. And to meet a Slovenian architect, a very young Slovenian architect, who is here today, it's Boštjan Bauer. And after we have met at the AA, and he said, you should come to Ljubljana. And I had no clue of the city. And he mentioned the name of an architect I had never heard, or only heard vaguely and with no really clue, Jože Plečnik. And this was the beginning of an everlasting love for the work of this man. And I'm quite intimidated to speak at this anniversary in this beautiful setting. This is actually the space that I saw first of Plečnik. And Boštjan did a great job. He said, let's go. I wonder how we can get up there. And I wondered too. because what is up there? There was no there. There were basically holes. And there was no second floor. And it was a beautiful mise en scène of the staging of an illusion which completely communicated a notion of play between the architecture and the audience. And I found this was absolutely thrilling. And so, wow, an architect with humor. That's rare. Even more. You would think some architect has built the temple in the back, and then some other arrogant architect built something right in front, destroying the view of this majestically centrally placed column. It's the same architect. Very beautiful. And you come to this little chapel and wonder, wow, what an interesting interpretation of a Rosetta window. And you look closer and you wonder, what is this? Oh, Doric columns around a dental frieze, which we know from Greek architecture, but somehow it looks different. There's a combination of things, the dental frieze and the cogwheel, antiquity and modernity rolled into one thing. Interestingly enough, in German, my mother tongue, you even use the same word, Zahnfries und Zahnrad. So there was something strange how the architect here was able to connect stories that span across the history, and how what I was impressed with is how he basically, by reusing and reinterpreting iconographical elements of the history of architecture, is able to make a connection to the present, to his own time, but not with the tabula rasa clash that modernism as a movement employed in this very time. And this was the most amazing thing for me, that Jože Plečnik was one of a kind. He really didn't belong into a movement, he kind of created one. But he made a very, very strong commentary on modernism in a way that you rarely find in other countries. Rudolf Schwarz would be an architect in Germany that I think has a similar kind of independent stance, criticizing and evolving a discourse that was too homogeneous otherwise. But now, if you try to kind of understand how does this actually work between the present and the past, let's make a little typological comparison. We could take any kind of Gothic Rosetta window and understand the family relationship that he draws upon. But then, to really understand what he is actually doing, I would like to employ a strategy from music. I actually think that to understand what architects can do today, when we are clear about the fact that we can no longer build as much anew as we used to, but have much more to process what we already have, it might be useful to actually understand a concept for music which is called covering, which is you take a piece of music and you reinterpret it. And the ways in which musicians reinterpret an original piece of music is very interesting, because it includes loyalty to the original combined with absolute freedom to do also things that are not in the original. Now, let's take an example. Got to Get You Into My Life was a phenomenal song in the history of pop music by the Beatles, because it employed, almost for the first time in this period of pop music, not just the classic arrangement of 2 guitars, 1 bass guitar and drums, and then voices, but also a brass section that was very novel at the time. Let's listen to how it actually sang, for those of you who don't remember. that are positively not part of the original. This is what I like. So it is true to the song, not by letter, not literally, but by the intensity of artistic empathy. You did it perfectly, much better than our song. Well, that's the generosity you have to employ. So when you look now at the Rosetta window, maybe you see different things. So there is a true commitment to the Gothic idea of the Rosetta window with a complete freedom to interpret its typological performance. And what I like about Plečnik a lot is that he basically came up with games, I think, for which there was no real precedent. So, for instance, we could, of course, talk about the bridge, but the building that I want to you to look at is the small one besides it, the flower shop. I think this is the best version of a mother and child kangaroo building in the history of architecture. And it is just adorable how he kind of ties you into a dialogue, because you want to know, why is there a small temple in the big one? How did he come up with this? And I think he wasn't really explicit about this, but maybe Andreas and Ákos Moravánszky would know more about it. Then if you walk a little bit further on, there is a very interesting discourse that he has with the phallocratic dimension of architecture. You find this one with a very clear statement of three phallic forms, one dominating the other ones. A little later, you find the opposite condition. And it's interesting if you compare them. You could, of course, interpret them, and actually a friend of mine came up with the name of the column of double impotence, which I like very, very much. And it's interesting that if you understand the sequence in which they were produced, because it means also one is a reaction to the other. In a way. It would be interesting if it's the other way, but it's this way, you know. So I find it interesting how Plečnik found such a relaxed relationship to male toxicity, and could show us men how we can relax about getting older. There is another column which seems the opposite, like again the kind of affirmation of phallocratic macho culture, but actually it isn't. It's never this simple with Plečnik. So we have the strong column, which we find in different moments of history, but there's also a small column. And this one is very funny. So this is the column of the Virgin Mary, and there's a sign that you see that is surrounding the circumference of the column, and the sign is, interestingly enough, carried by a column that doesn't meet the ground. It cannot relay its load to the ground as it would structurally normally need to do it. But it is basically fixed to the big column by some kind of a belt. It's a fantastically absurd proposition. And only, I think, Plečnik was able to come up with something like this. It reminds me of operations of Jacques Tati, who seems to be a brother in spirit to him, when in Jour de Fête, this postman that he plays wants to be more efficient. He's impressed by the Americans and how modern they are, and they use technology, and he wants to be more efficient. We heard before that it's efficiency, efficiency, efficiency now. Personally, I think it's sufficiency, sufficiency, sufficiency. But he wants to be efficient, so he doesn't mark his letters in the office, but on the bike, and he kind of cannibalizes this truck for this display of productivity. You know, it changes the way you look at the column. He made incredible columns, and very often they are like singular and central. But then you have this beautiful condition in the entrance hall of the library, which I think has always struck me as an auratic and mythical space. But again, it's not like devastatingly serious, but temptingly playful. And it draws you into a question-answer dialogue. Because you wonder what happened to these columns. They kind of sunk into the ground. Let's go back. So there are the big columns, and there are the Doric columns that are kind of sunk in the ground. They are now a railing, so that you don't fall into, so they have a function, but they could almost also be a bench. So there's a playful abuse of the historical tradition and a reprogrammation, what they could be else than just columns. It reminds me of this beautiful scene in That's Mon Oncle, where the sister, I think, of Monsieur Hulot, who lives in this staggeringly modern house, has this very unuseful piece of furniture, because you can understand that it's not comfortable to sit on this thing. If you sit on this, you will have a pain in your back, a little bit like you get a pain in your butt sitting on these chairs after some hours, and I really empathize with you, and thank you for taking the pain. But Monsieur Hulot, after coming home from a night at the pub, while his sister and her husband were at the opera, for which he's a little bit too simple, so he goes to the pub, gets drunk, comes home drunk, and makes himself at home. And he makes the only reasonable choice. He understands how this piece of shitty furniture could actually become functional by rotating it 90 degrees. And there's something of that here too, this playful appropriation of a classical element that you could, of course, apply to the letter, but you could also transform it. And this is what I love about Plečnik, that he kind of honored tradition by transforming it. He doesn't insult tradition by copying it, which is what I think would mean. And it goes on, of course, to a building that I only saw recently, and that I think probably blows every architect's mind when you see this massive building. And I was not prepared to the space behind this clock that you see, this incredible ramped space. I mean, Corbusier thought he was cool with Villa Savoye and his ramps. Take that, Corbu. That's a lot more radical and more interesting. And you come to this very interesting moment of a scale kind of diversion, where the scale of the human walking on the ramp, going up, collides with the monumental scale of the clock, which relates to the scale of the city. So here you feel immediately exposed to the city in a way that is, for me, was unprecedented. I've never felt that the city swallows me whole so intensely as here. And you stand behind this huge window, and you watch the movements of the pointers as they go minute by minute. And just to understand what a minute means in terms of distance at this scale, let's watch the pointer strike 1 minute. That's still a minute. I mean, you see, technology. I think it's this one. Good. Let's still hope there's a good end. We know that we need to practice this discipline now. Okay. So, I hope it wasn't the video that caused it to crash. Okay, we've seen this. And how can you not think of that moment that's practically at the same time, I mean, this film, historically speaking, and then understand that this is not simply how many people kind of misunderstood the work of Plečnik, an anticipation of postmodern architecture. I think this is like the wrongest and deeply hurtful accusation, I would say. Plečnik is, of course, something completely else. And my favorite building, because I think it's the most enigmatic project of Plečnik, but also one of the most enigmatic buildings in the history of architecture to begin with, is St. Michael in Černovalsk. The building is so interesting because you cannot really classify it. I mean, basically it is a Catholic church, which doesn't feel like any Catholic church I've ever visited. It has this beautiful ambiguity of different iconographic forces that are sometimes hard to pin down. For instance, you see these very interesting columns, of which we speak a little later, but there's a lot of wood in the building. And what is interesting is that the orientation of the building is, the orientation of the seating is perpendicular to the axis of the church. So that's the first thing that is different. So you enter sideways and you cross through the short axis of the building. You see these paintings on the wooden posts, and they're kind of hard to kind of frame. What kind of iconographic tradition does this really respond to? Then you see this beautiful play between the four concrete columns. There are actually concrete columns, and the wooden frame that's resting above them. And what is beautiful here is that these concrete columns is something that I learned from Andreas, who once explains this us in this church, are actually sewage types made of concrete. And they're a completely pragmatic choice because they couldn't work with stones or real concrete, and they took these prefab elements, he joined them together, had them polished, and then painted. And I guess they're filled out in the middle to be structurally, right? They're not hollow, they're of course. So you see this beautiful kind of, I mean, ambiguous chaos of iconographic references. On the left side, you see these golden polished arches with the red curtains. To me, who is not an expert in religion, but I relate this to more an Orthodox church space. It's not really clear if Plečnik made this allusion voluntarily or it's just my fantasy, because he was a strict Catholic believer. But then again, I believe there's cross-dressing in religion too, maybe. And maybe he was secretly interested in it. So you have like a couple of different iconographic and narrative layers that weave into each other in this space, and which has the capacity to even turn architecture critics into priests, you know, and preachers. This is how Andre explained us the space in 2016. Now, when you look at the encounter of a concrete column made of sewage pipes put together, polished, and painted. And this wooden construction that may appeal to, or that may reference Scandinavic expressions of architecture, maybe, to some of us. For me, there is something interesting happening that I like to follow in contemporary music, like, for instance, by Nitin Sawhney, who is a British Asian artist who was born and grew up in London to parents coming from India. And he never lived in India, but he was very interested in understanding his cultural roots. And he made music to bridge the gap between the two and understand the negotiation between them. We listened to a short piece by him, and I wrote down in the video the logic of progression of 4 movements. There's 4 movements, and they basically make they cater to these different traditions of Indian music and London drum and bass club music. And it's very interesting how he uses these 2 tracks so that each culture kind of cannibalizes the other one. Now, let's listen to it. Can go down with the sound again. This is obviously a very subjective kind of mapping of a piece of music to this piece of architecture, but why I'm doing this in order to show the ways in which I think Plečnik was able to work with different kind of cultural traditions. My understanding is that he was very interested in the notion of Mediterranean culture, and he tried to reference the enormous tradition and history of this space. And I like a lot how he kind of consciously impurifies this tradition, mixing things that are from very different contexts into something that is, albeit contradictory, quite sound to me. As sound, as this probably most unresolvable space in the history of architecture of the 20th century. That's my own judgment. I'm a huge lover of this film by Stanley Kubrick, 2001, A Space Odyssey. You probably know this, this film, but what I think is so beautiful in the meaning of this film, this image at the end, is that it makes us understand that we need to negotiate our relationship to our own present condition. And I think it's very interesting that if you understand that the film was done in 1968, in the very moment where we had maybe for the last time the believable illusion that we could change our societies. Many people had. My mother had. And I cannot say that I had this in my lifetime after that. So it's a very interesting moment. But in this moment, if we go a bit further, now I need you to put the sound absolutely down. You must not listen to the soundtrack until I tell you that we can. It's very important. Okay, let's... Oh, this didn't really play. Why is that so? Then maybe we do this. Does this move? Yes, it moves. So the crazy thing about this film is that it begins I mean, this is the second chapter in the movie. There's one before, but this is an example of Kubrick's ingenious talent to work in contradictory ways with the sound and the image. So if we look at the image, we only see the affirmation of modernism, the idea that with the clever use of technology, we're completely able to solve our civilizational problems. It was the narrative, the grand narrative at the time. And with the film, Kubrick actually does the opposite. Can you now slightly move up the sound? then, or actually there's a mistake here. Yes, actually it's like this. Then the astronaut enters the space station and it lands in this space. And this is now like the affirmation of contemporary culture at that time. It's like everything that modernity had to offer at this time. There's the light ceiling, there's the furnitures, and the space is curved, obviously, because it's a big spherical volume. Now, there's a very interesting shot, which you only understand later on, which I kind of misplaced in the order, forgive me. So this is where he has to check in. There's fingerprint sensing and stuff like this. What's important here is the light ceiling. The light ceiling in this time was a cutting-edge piece of technology in American office architecture, and that was used throughout as this liberation of this dumb thing called daylight. Who wants that, right? Because the office buildings in America had such large kind of depths, I mean, deep ground plans. You needed artificial light, and this was thought to be the ideal solution. Now, if we go, then you need to understand that the space mission, for those who haven't seen it, completely fails, terribly fails, nothing works, one astronaut survives, and barely manages to land on some alien planet. He doesn't have a clue to be wherein, and he enters that space. And this is this absolute moment of complete confusion, where, for him and for us, where he wonders, I was destined towards the future, and look where I ended, in some weird artificial rococo, with a lit floor. Am I John Travolta or what? And then briefly after this, he lies down on the bed, and the time accelerates, and he dies and is reborn as a baby. And this kind of inversion of what is present and what is past is something that I see in the work of our master that we celebrate today all the time, and that's why I love him. Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. We have a few moments if anybody wants to pose a question. Please do. Petra.
Andreas, thank you very much for this really entertaining and inspiring lecture. And my question, but I have some reservation. In this lecture, you presented Plečnik's work very much, I would say, through meaning, through associations. In a way, if I would be a bit critical, would say that you reduced it to a sign. A sign. A sign. And I think you left out a very important dimension of Plečnik's work, which is that it is a result of material construction and that it is a thing. So I wonder if you just think that in his work, this dimension of materiality is not that important, or you just chose to just focus on one dimension. And then a sub-question would be, if I understood right, you said that you don't consider him a postmodernist? No. Okay, and it's interesting. Ah, okay, sorry. Okay, then, yeah, okay, then just please, if you would reflect on that, thanks.
No, of course, the material dimension is super important with him. I mean, it's very clear when you experience his architecture. But I wanted to focus on this particular aspect of how he plays with different cultural iconographies, and I think these kind of collages of systems of meanings is quite interesting. And he uses the history of architecture, the vocabulary of architecture. He uses the typological arsenal of architecture in order to create something more than the functional narrative. I think it's interesting how Plečnik managed to escape the big temptation of modernism at that time, that convinced or almost kind of seduced lots of architects to basically cut with history and said, you know, this is done. the old town is no longer of meaning. I mean, when you read Corbusier's readings about La Rue Corridor, you feel this contempt for the history and this militant desire to break away from that, and the understanding that only if we actually make tabula rasa with the history of architecture and the city, we can create that which we can genuinely invent. And I think this understanding of invention and innovation is very outdated. And what's interesting about an architect like Plečnik is that he obviously found a way how he could, in the same way as musicians, that's why I'm making this parenthesis, go through the tradition of his discipline, but not literally so, not by repeating it, but by reconfiguring it. And I think I like the act of interpretation in his work, and I like the playfulness in it. And I wish that heritage preservation, for instance, would inspire itself from this freedom. I find it's an architecture of intellectual freedom, and this is what I wanted to focus upon. I thought, of course, you being around with him all the time, you of course know his buildings, and I don't need to tell you how gorgeous its materiality is.
No, well, if he invented something, then there's always a capacity that he's always reinvented. You don't
Yes.
have to be a local in order to do that. So yeah, you showed certain dimension which I haven't seen before, so I appreciate it.
That's very nice. Thank you.
Historians hate when you use history.
Sorry?
Historians don't like when we use history, no? That's the first point. Well, I don't need a microphone. No, it's a very, I mean, it was fun, it was super fun. I remember one of my PhD colleagues doing in Venice a PhD on sex and sensuality in Plečnik, of course with Luciano Semerani. So it's not a completely new topic, but when we like critical people, we go into history and pick up to say your things, then historians generally react. It happens. I have no judgment on this, but it happens, and then especially when you are in the hometown of the thing. But I mean, in Venice, this would have been like they would have waited outside for you to kill you, no? After a lecture like this. I mean, yes. Yeah. But it was a lot of fun.
Okay, thank you, Pippo. Any further questions? Okay. We are not making breaks, so we're going to sit there for the next two talks as well. So thank you, Andreas. The Killing Peep squad is going to wait outside. Thank you very much. Thank you. As you can see, there is a tempo to this, so it's not going to be terribly long. Our next guest is a practicing architect. Jonathan Sergison has a practice operating in Zurich and London. He has been, well, there is a kind of a very long text here, but I'm just going to kind of make it shorter. He has been working in both London and Zurich for the last, well, I don't know how long in Zurich, but for the last 20-something years, running a practice with Stephen Bates. He teaches, or used to teach in different universities on North London, Mendrisio. Now you're running an institute, or you're a director of the Institute for Urban Studies and Landscape. You run the Swiss office, but why we actually proposed Jonathan for today's talk, and the title of his talk is Why History, is that we think that it's one of the practices that whose work in a way is in continuous relation or discussion with the historical. We thought that it could be interesting to see somebody else's work in well, because I think you're going to show some of your own work, hopefully, in relation to Plečnik's, let's say, idea of that kind of constructing the future out of fragments of history in Panofskian terms.
Good. Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I feel slightly set up, being billed after that sort of barnstorming performance and the scholarship and erudition that I feel we're about to hear. And Vasa, thank you for insisting on my position being that of a practitioner, because I think that brings, let's say, certain freedoms and responsibilities. But from my point of view, it's really a great pleasure to be back in Ljubljana. We had this sort of delightful conversation in the summer where I said, but I don't really feel like I know enough about Plečnik to contribute to a cycle of talks on this fascinating architect's work. And you said, well, you should try and make some connection to what we're doing. And so what really interests me is the title that I've given. And after that last intervention, I'm slightly nervous about even the title, Why History? I thought this would be a very kind of agreeable collection of people. I feel very stressed. So, to begin with, I can only say that I've been to Ljubljana once before. I came with my students from Mednarodni. By the way, I still do teach design. And we were looking at this work together. And in fact, on that occasion, I asked each group, a pair of students, to present to the rest of us one project. And these form memories of that visit. I mean, I certainly was struck by the insurance building, the cemetery that has already been presented in such an interesting way. His house and studio, which is, I guess, meters from where we are. What I feel like is such an amazing piece of public realm, the Triple Bridge, a way of making city. This kind of micro building, a Flatiron building. And this church left a strong impression on me, the square plan and the scale of the columns. I remember being very powerful. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of the interior. And lastly, the National Library, which again, of course, is meters from where we are. But that's about it in terms of Plečnik. And really, I'm thoroughly looking forward to the next lecture. And I must also add that I enjoyed the last one. But another project that I would add to this collection is this house that we went to see. I understand made by a pupil of Plečnik. And I find this house really radical. I mean, the way that it employs this big arch and the sort of scale of that space as an entrance, that touched me. But to say it again, the reason that I feel like I've been invited to take part in this symposium is because our architectural practice, the practice that I'm a founding partner of, has and does declare an interest in the history of architecture. In our projects, we draw upon historical references. But this point needs to be qualified. When we refer to buildings from the past, we see this as an act of an interpretation. Our projects are contemporary, and they're conditioned by the time and the circumstances in which they have been conceived. They are not new buildings trying to look as if they are old buildings. There are architects who explore this possibility. We do not. In fact, we think it's futile to try. Increasingly, we're involved in the task of restoring and conserving and preserving buildings. This is a task that could be understood as one of reuse. And in itself, it is a complex topic and one that fascinates us. But returning to the question of history, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. A very well-known saying attributed to the writer and philosopher George Santayana. This quote is frequently cited in relation to why the knowledge of history is necessary and cautions against a neglect of the lessons that it holds. But what should be said in terms of the history of architecture? In general terms, history is the retelling of events that occurred in the past, interpreting the actions of people and the circumstances that they were reacting to. Architectural history is more concrete because it is in relation to buildings. It affords the possibility of learning from looking at them as tangible physical things. Architectural historians seek to establish a basis of fact upon which they create an historical narrative. But it is, to some extent, a construct and should be considered as such. Ákos, I hope you're not offended by this practitioner's freedom. We know from the history that the Renaissance, the rebirth, was a period when reappraisal occurred in relation to classical fragments. Help was offered in terms of an important treatise produced by Vitruvius, which created the basis for understanding classical architecture. And these volumes were studied and applied to the buildings that were realized in Italy in around 1450, which in turn were studied and copied, improved upon in time in Italy and more widely. There is also a relationship to the notion of learning from what might be perceived as a mistake made in the past. In this sense, architectural history has a relationship to the need to improve upon and to correct. And let me offer you a rather well-known example that I was looking at with my students in Mendrisio last semester. Michelozzi, who was strongly influenced by Brunelleschi, applied quite directly the loggia of the Foundlings Hospital to solve the organization of the courtyard of the Medici Palace. At first sight, this is understandable and logical, but closer inspection reveals that an architectural problem cannot be solved by simply applying another solution to a different situation without making the necessary adjustments to take account of their circumstances. By applying the facade of a Foundlings Hospital to a four-sided courtyard, where the original version works as a flat surface and a symmetrical composition can be seen to be too direct and unrefined. And there are deficiencies that can be registered in this part of a building that are worth understanding in more detail. Firstly, by applying the Foundlings Hospital to a four-sided courtyard, a single column on the corner appears to be weak or fragile. In the original project, this situation does not arise because one column does not have the need to strengthen a corner. In time, it was understood that it is better to have more than a single column on a corner of a courtyard. Secondly, by employing the same windows on the first floor level and directly above the half-rounded archways, when it comes to the corners, they are much closer together and not evenly distributed as they are in the Foundlings Hospital, where the surface is flat and not folded on four sides. And thirdly, the roundels suffer a similar fate to the corners as they appear to be too close together and not equally distributed. This example illustrates the difficulty of taking an existing model and applying it to a different set of conditions. It is evident that classical architecture demands a skillful form of interpretation, the invention of solutions for a particular task in question. In the 15th century, the canon of classical architecture was tailored to the needs of the time. The ancient Greeks had understood 2,000 years earlier that mastery requires an ability to make adjustments to the elements of a building in order to ensure that an architect's intention is perceived by the eye. Naturally, this requires great skill and the experience of building. The shortcomings of Michelozzi's work were addressed to some extent in the Palazzo Cancellaria here in Rome, which was begun in 1485. But it is in Urbino, 2 decades after the completion of the Palazzo Medici, that in the ducal palace, the courtyard finally resolves this issue of the corner by creating more weight, more substance, and a much better spacing of the elements of the facade. While there are undoubtedly many mistakes that have been made in relation to what has been built throughout history, there is also so much to learn that is inspiring, instructive, and this includes mistakes and learning from the lessons of history. The circumstances in which buildings from the past were realized is sometimes factually recorded in terms of archival documentation. And as is often the case with history, sometimes it is anecdotal, which means it is not necessarily reliable information. We are free to establish our own relationship to buildings from the past and the manner in which we might incorporate them in our own work as an act of interpretation. As contemporary architects, we're not so bound by the rules of an overarching canon. We feel free to draw upon things that we find useful and relevant, and is open to opinion and influenced by the interests of us as individuals. The English historian and writer Hilary Mantel, who died recently, wrote, "It is possible for competent historians to come to radically different conclusions on the basis of the same evidence. Because, of course, 99% of the evidence, above all, is unrecorded speech and is not available to us. Evidence is always partial. Facts are not truth, though they are part of it. Information is not knowledge, and history is not the past. It is a method that we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It is the record of what is left on the record. It is the plan of the positions taken when we stop the dance to note them down. It is what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, scraps of cloth. It is no more the past than a birth certificate is a birth, or a script is a performance, or a map is a journey. It is the multiplication of the evidence of the fallible and biased witnesses, combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who perform them. It is no more than the best we can do, and often it falls short of that. I cannot say I've always been interested in architectural history or known how I could learn from it the lessons of history. My own architectural education was a modernist one, and with this came a certain conviction that anything that occurred between 1920 was not relevant. Modernist dogma was convinced of a need to invent new building solutions and a new image of architecture that had no relationship to the past. While the first ambition was to some extent achieved, the inventions that have been made in terms of building technology, the second is more questionable. A new image was found in things that already existed, looking at ocean liners, grain silos, and other building structures that related to industry, or simple vernacular buildings from the Mediterranean. But it was not missed on me that the first generation of well-known modernist architects had a solid grounding in the canon of classical architectural traditions. And in time, I've come to understand that what they were seeking was to replace one architectural canon with another. When I was 18, I traveled to Italy for the first time, and I remember visiting Venice and Florence and Milan, and later in my second year of architectural studies. Sounds like a great conversation, but it's slightly disturbing. With my teachers and fellow students, we visited many cities in the north of Italy and the Renaissance architecture that they contain. But I cannot say that I was touched in the same way that they touch me now. I know that they were important, but I could not see how they could be useful to me at the time. In time, this has changed. Today, I have a very different relationship to the history of architecture, and while increasingly I find it necessary to refer to what could be called high architecture, seminal buildings from the past, but more widely, the journeys that I find myself making throughout Europe and occasionally further afield expose me to a wealth of material, buildings that might not even be the work of architects, neighborhoods, landscapes, details, fragments, furniture, all things that might offer the possibility of being interpreted or that could be instructive in terms of what we're working on. Returning to the work I was doing with my students last semester, my students in Mendrisio, working in Florence, we were talking about this example. Michelangelo's work, the invention that comes from a very pragmatic need to build a structure on top of an existing wall. And this incredible space, a space filled with a staircase, a project that I found myself speculating on in terms of whether it was known to Plečnik, because the National Library building seems to explore similar elements. A staircase that pretty much fills a room, and the scale and proportion of the reading room. But this is entirely a speculation on my part. And I also revisited the building again this afternoon, and I was struck by the setting of the building in relation to the space the National Library looks onto. And I was reminded of the situation of the Medici Palace. But we also found ourselves looking at the Uffizi, which along with the Strada Nova, and by the way, this semester we're working in Genova, can be understood as the first conscious urbanizing idea, the making of a street, or the numerous big houses, the palazzi in Florence, a type that emerged, as I've already suggested, through a process of refining the examples that preceded each one and how they became a dominant building solution. And here, a useful photograph in relation to the point that I was making about the siting of a National Gallery. Okay. Now I sort of fulfill my duty. Andreas, I really enjoyed your lecture, but that notion of sampling is perhaps what I'm building upon in the work that I'm showing now. This notion of learning from and adjusting, and somehow through that conscious process, making something that is neither original, but it is special, let's hope. I was also very happy to hear the Beatles. I'm always happy to hear the Beatles, eventually. And I was reminded of a interview with John Lennon where a rather cocky interviewer asked, "Mr. Lennon, do you think Ringo Starr is the best drummer in the world?" To which John Lennon said, "He's not even the best drummer in the Beatles." Apparently, Paul is quite a good drummer. Here in this project, a competition entry for a new town hall, we were trying to make a palazzo, a building that could be understood as a big house. Now, what I understand about the origins of a palazzo, as I already mentioned, is that they were structurally, the social structure of a palazzo was very, very complex. What I thought at first glance was a very generous gesture to the public realm, the making of a stone bench at the base of a wall, was later explained to me as a rather pragmatic way of protecting the wall against the wheels of carts, and also offering a place for the visitors of the palazzo to sit outside, anticipating an audience with the resident of the building. And of course, the more people sitting outside, the more important the people inside were perceived. In a project that we're working on in London for a pencil tower, apart from this sort of fascination with the making of a tower within an existing contested situation, referenced the image on the left, there is also the memory of Kadurk's work in Barceloneta, this incredible plan that came through a process of numerous iterations, starting with a rather orthogonal base. And in the towers, the plans of this tower, the manner in which it shifts and adjusts, exploring different apartment configurations. Or in another competition entry that we made in the city of Hamburg, the memory of the Chili House helped inform our competition entry for this office building in Hamburg. It was perhaps implied in the introduction, but I am a Londoner. And for me, that in part means a relationship to a dominant housing solution that was employed in the making of London in what is referred to as the Georgian period. And in that time, London was built on the basis of only 4 house types, repeated again and again and again, and organized generally as terraced streets, occasionally as squares or crescents or even circles. But it, for me, is a solution, an urbanizing solution that I find really fascinating. Because at first glance, it appears to work on the basis of repetition, but in a very sort of English way, it's a little bit sloppy. Things aren't exactly the same. It is, I think, an inherently tolerant way of building. The terraced house has a problem always of how to deal with the end. But when it's dealing with repetition in terms of making a street, it's much more comfortable. And in our work, on occasion, we've attempted to deal with our own relationship to the interests and the lessons that these older examples of urbanizing present to us. Here, a housing project that we won, a social housing project won in 1999. By the way, I studied at the AA, which is very close to where this photograph is taken. So this sort of sense of a London where a deep familiarity with this housing solution was part of my own education, which it took me a long time to make sense of. And this interest in the terraced house continues. Here, a more recent project, a very small project that we're also working on in London. And I'm not the kind of teacher that does one thing and tells my students to do the other, because in many semesters, this point about learning from looking at things that exist is one of the key aspects of the work that we do. And here, an exercise in survey. We now have a huge catalogue of survey studies that the students have done in Mednarodni. Here, part of a 6-semester work that we undertook in Zurich. And this sense of learning from the wealth of architecture that exists in the world, a visitor center that we built in Shanghai several years ago was thinking rather more generally in the early development of a project and the questioning of what an office building might be understood as. And while the example that Auguste Perret offers here in Le Havre is not housing, this simple classicism, as he referred to it, it's helpful in terms of a sense of proportion. And perhaps the most striking or significant reference is a building in London by the Dutch architect Berlage, in fact a project entitled Holland House, where he was working with terracotta elements arranged with a dominant vertical. And in the building now that I introduced already, this headquarters for a Swiss company in Shanghai that sits alongside a building by the Basel office of Diener and Diener on the left. And our work, a competition entry won in the early 2000s with the Geneva architect Jean-Paul Jacot, working on a corner site in Geneva, where from more or less the outset, we were interested in trying to develop a project that sought to reconcile the different architectures of the neighboring conditions. On the left, 19th century school building, and the building that you can see on the right of a right-hand image, office and commercial center by Marc Sergey. And in the making of the corners of this project, we turned to one of our favorite buildings, or building ensembles in London, the Economist building by Alison and Peter Smithson, learning that within all of the possibilities of how to make a corner, mitering it or turning it has certain advantages. Another competition that we won in 1997 invited us to consider a revision to this older UK housing solution, the double house. Something like 3 million of these houses were built in the period from 1920 to the late 1930s. And in the UK, it is really the suburban solution that was employed very widely in cities and towns throughout the UK. Or much more recently, a project completed in the Belgium city of Antwerp, where with 2 other offices we made a new urban block, with our contribution being the brick building that you can see in this image. A building that is endeavoring to evoke the memory of the kind of pragmatic way of building serving an industrial purpose from the past. And also, very recently, the completion of this housing project in North London. A project that, in terms of its exterior expression, drew upon the reference of the arts and crafts buildings that were built at the end of the 19th century in this part of London, but also the memory of the mansion block, which is a particularly English solution to creating a denser form of housing than certainly the terrace house was able to offer. But in this work, we were also drawing upon the inspiration and the influence of northern Italian architects, such as Capodilumione, working in the period from the late 1940s to very much more recently. And the plan of this project, which I still kind of can't believe has been built, deliberately sought to create a constellation of rooms of differing shapes, interconnecting, and certainly working with the possibility of the inner hall and a tremendous depth of plan. And this wonderful image by the German artist and photographer Thomas Struth, I think for me is a kind of very instructive and helpful record of the possibilities of what an urban architecture might be. The sense in which one building has been added to the ones that preceded it, with its own ideas, but also a sense of conformity to the qualities that the older buildings might inform. And this wonderful house in central London by Adam, the possibility of a door which is off-center, but also central to a street. And here in this social housing project in North London, we are working with very much this notion of the space between. Or here in Vienna, a project where we made the building that you can see in the center of this collection of 3. Or finally, this housing project in Zurich, which we completed a couple of years ago, is a further exploration of this interest in learning from the notion of an urbanism of the space between. And I would also say the Economist building is instructive in those terms. Good. So, something about history, and then the courage to show our own work as a pretense that we talk about history in our work. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you very much. Questions? Okay, I don't see that well. So.
I mean, how do you source your references and how are they connected? Like, what is the process in the offices of saying, okay, for this project, this could be an interesting pool of references, and then what's the actual process to then the building?
I think when Stephen Bates and I started collaborating, the need to refer to things became necessary as a way of sharing an idea. So to use reference rather consciously as a basis for proposition was a consequence of two people trying to find some kind of common ground with the working of a project. But the other thing that I would say in answer to your question is that the other aspect of it is the unique conditions always of the place that you find yourself working in. And for me, this is one of the great kind of the wonderful things about what we do as architects, that you never have the choice in terms of where you work, but you have a duty to make a meaningful reflection or to find a project that is a response to the place that you find yourself working with. So I would say those two conditions are at the core of our working method. The sense in which the program that we get and all of the kind of, the more technical information, but the physical conditions of a place, which are always uniquely special. Although Stephen and I and our third partner, Mark, always feel like everywhere we find ourselves working is in sort of the margins of cities, in often rather unpromising places where you have to work much harder to find a meaningful response. I think working in the historical center of a city is much more complex, but it's also somehow more exciting.
And is there a reason why most of the references are mainly, let's say, Eurocentric or North America-centric, or at least the ones shown here?
I think I spoke about Italy a lot, and I count that as a Mediterranean country. But sorry, Northern European.
No, I meant European. So, for example, there's no references to, I don't know, Asian countries or South America. I mean, is there a reason for that, or?
Yeah, there's a good reason, which is that's where we work, and it's perhaps well, I did show a reference to a North American city, but our work is really based in continental Europe or in the UK. So I think to draw upon what feels like a kind of already rich and limitless source of reference is, for us, is sort of very, very fulfilling. And the risk with your question is that I wouldn't want to have the burden of feeling like a kind of cultural tourist. I mean, I really don't know I've been to Chile a few times, but I would struggle to meaningfully use references from cultures that I'm not familiar with. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had a question to follow up to something you just said. When you work in the periphery. So in cities' peripheral areas where maybe, so working, for example, building social housing in the periphery of a city, in a place that maybe doesn't have the kind of, I don't know, richness and diversity in terms of aesthetic marks as a city center, a historical city center of Florence or something. Yeah, how do you work with that? Like creating the sense of place, or yeah, you said it's harder, but in a way you also try to reconnect to what is there that is meaningful. Yeah, how is that process working for you in like a gray, dull kind of outskirt context?
Eventually you find traces, you know, you just have to work a little harder, but there are things that start to become helpful and instructive. You know, in most of any city is periphery, you know, the suburbs amounts for the largest land surface of any city. So in a way, we're sort of destined to work in more marginal places. But you just have to work and find the traces and try to bring meaning to the task that you're asked to fulfill. But I think making a house that sits without anything around it is really difficult. I mean, I think that's why, you know, what I've tried to suggest is our understanding of the urban lies in relation to a new relationship you establish by building a building in relation to the buildings that have already been there. I think building in the city centre has the historical centre. I mean, it's in many European cities, the historical centre almost has the status of a museum. So to imagine working there is also equally complex. No, I'm impressed that the altitude. This guy doesn't have a problem with heights.
Okay. So, Jonathan, thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you for. Since Andreas mentioned this, the uncomfortableness of these chairs, I've been thinking about it. How come we made one continuous event of 2.5 hours? But we still have a third guest, our third guest tonight. Ákos Moravánszky has been here before. We have a break, or what? Ah, okay. Okay, so there is a break. So there is a break. So we start at 5 to 7. Okay? Thank you. Okay. So let's just restart. Okay, Ákos Moravánszky, you know him. Some of my students also know him from before. He has been here quite a few times. He is a professor emeritus of ETH Zurich. You can correct my mistakes afterwards if I did something wrong. He is an architect and architectural historian, and he has been working at the Institute, GTA Institute. It's History and Theory Institute of the ETH Zurich, for the second part of his career, at least. He has worked with students here before. They presented us today with a book that Hrauski is proudly holding over there. So some of you know it. He has written extensively about the history of the architecture, especially of the 20th century, but with very diverse subjects, from Los to Ber de Plaze, so a very large span of the work of the 20th century. Well, Ber de Plaze is still a 21st century office still. Today his lecture, or his talk, he's somehow the historian of the trio, no? And the title of his lecture is Refiguring Architecture, Plečnik's Metamorphosis. Ákos, welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for introducing me. And although the theme of ritual will kind of pop up in my lecture, but it is not a ritual when I start with thanks because of such invitations to your school. And I'm remembering it was almost 30 years ago when I first came, and Andreas Hrauski, Dusan Blaganye, and of course, Damian Peloušek were showing me around and made a point that they are showing me the work of Plečnik and not Plečnik. That was an Austrian architectural office who probably you won't know the name now, but at that time, probably, at least it was assumed that I know more about Plečnik than about Plečnik. That was not really true. But indeed, I needed this introduction into the work of him in Ljubljana. And then it was the teaching last year, Tadej Glažar, and the wonderful group of students who ended up producing this booklet that just came out. It was a wonderful surprise for me. And then we still have this exchange with Petra Čeferin, and I think all the outcome of these connections, conversations, and so on informed me and had flown into the lecture that I'm going today, and that is called, as you see, Refiguring Architecture, Plečnik's Metamorphosis. And refiguring has two meanings. On one hand, the title is a reference to the importance of figuration, meaning the figure, the pictorial, the representational in Plečnik's architecture. And just, the lectures that we have listened to today showed this incredible interest in working with the images from history, distorting them, as Andreas has shown, turning a molding around and almost torturing it. How far can you go by distorting history when it starts to lose its meaning, when the forms start to not to be able anymore to carry, all these layers of historical memory that they connected. But this is only one issue, the question of the figure. By refiguring, I also mean the rethinking, the redefinition of architecture, its extraction from the conceptual system of a very long tradition that we know as the Vitruvian tradition of architecture. So my lecture is very much about, interruptions, breaks, and even denials. Utilitas, firmitas, venustas, we all know the keywords. They all point toward the tectonic integrity and beauty of the structural frame. This is the dualistic theory, a dualistic unity, one should say, of column and architrave, on which the practice and theory of architecture is based. In periods when the ornament seemed to overtake, it seemed to threaten the sound foundations of Vitruvian rationality, then authoritative voices came and called to order, such as Kenneth Frampton, for instance, with his influential book, Studies in Tectonic Culture. It was the time, of course, of postmodernism. This word was already spelled out, and Frampton, justifiably, was afraid that it really will lead to a kind of a dissolution of architecture in the networks of media. And he was pointing not only to the classical tradition, but its different kind of local variations. I think it was very important, but it was still, built on this kind of foundation. The truth of the architectural structure as something that we all have to observe. And in difference to this tectonic culture, Plečnik points to the tapestry, to the culture of dressing as the essence of architecture, to something that was generally regarded as secondary, because it is not necessary, at least it was thought it is not necessary, it is hiding, it is masking the truthful construction. And modern architects, as you know, were frequently speaking about unveiling, demasking, in order to reveal the truth of the structural core. The nuda veritas, the naked truth, that is something that doesn't need coverings and dressings. But for Plečnik, dressing had nothing to do with disguising. Truth unfolds in a process of veiling and unveiling that interrupts the supposed firmness of the tectonic. I chose Plečnik's early Zachel house in Vienna to illustrate this radical newness of the proposal. You may say the house as an erratic rock, a block of granite that reflects little of the main architectural currents of its time. It can be neither linked to historicism, nor the Vienna secession, nor national romanticism that came somewhat later. It is maybe the structural decoration of the facade, Ferdinand Andri's sculpture of St. Michael, or the Telamones of Franz Metzner supporting the cornice that would anchor the building in the stylistic trends of an era. Does this difficulty of classification in terms of stylistic classification have to do with that kind of timelessness that since Frances Delay is often described as an architectura perennis, as an eternal, as an enduring architecture? Does this term denote, as you see here, bottom left, the timeless humanistic architecture of Jožef Plečnik, as the UNESCO's webpage declares? The perception of stasis in Plečnik's architecture could be explained by his proximity to the aspirations of the Beuron painter monks who wanted no progress, no activity, just a hut on the Mount of Transfiguration, quiet contemplation. They relied on an aesthetic of timelessness. Plečnik's architectura perennis, and I myself wrote and apologize for quoting myself, but I just wanted to raise doubts, is dominated by an ideal of the eternal and immutable. The circular movement, which assures the survival of the same things by constant repetition, is the perfect and most immediate expression of an absolute immobility. Nothing new is created and nothing lost. No form is unique. Everything existed, is existing now, and will exist perpetually, unquote. And today, as I said, I am doubtful if I was right when I wrote this. Otto Wagner's post office savings banks that was executed some years later than the Zachel house provides a particularly interesting comparison. As one of the last buildings of the Ringstrasse development, this building is the capstone of the street and a monument to a new, more socially minded financial policy. With its open forecourt and the two streets lining the trapezoidal streets, the facade offers a moment of quiet amidst the flow of the Ringstrasse, one could say. It would like observers to stand still and enjoy the festive gestures that celebrate the imperial grandeur of Vienna. The laurel wreaths, the figures of angels, the acroteria. By contrast, the Zachel House anticipates an observer in motion. Both the massing and the details, from the load-bearing telamones to the cornice ornamentation, they are all transmitting impressions of energy and motion. The city and its constantly changing lights are reflected in the polished stone facade. The building was erected at a time when the metropolis has just been discovered as being an atmospheric ambience. The facade is vertically arranged with a system of cladding panels and granite pilasters. Plečnik has devoted himself to the problem of the dynamic equilibrium of verticality and horizontality, which is particularly evident in the design of the transition zone between the massive entablature and the delicately detailed facade pattern. At the same time, this very zone, which corresponds to the frieze in classical architecture, is a task to be addressed spatially, because this is where the layers of the massing, with their different functions of loading, supporting, enclosing, defining space, all meet. And Plečnik's early drawings are clearly comparable to the studies of the architectural details of the Baroque architects like Michelangelo and so on, in which they try to convey notions of carrying and movement by fusing anthropomorphic sculptural and architectural forms. Dynamic handmade drawings and precisely constructed details emerge, some Baroque, like in this case. The third slide shows a sketch by Plečnik during his first Italian trip. And some others are almost kind of foreshadowing the forms of Czech cubism. Like in this case, this is another study, another sketch for the entablature of the Zachel building, and as comparison two drawings by Pavel Janák that were made, as you can see, a decade later. I see this drawing to the left as a key to understand this intention behind the facade, between the stone-clad membrane-like surface and the body of building. And in between, as you can see, there is a kind of a plant-like element that seems to exert a pressure to keep the distance between the skin and the supporting construction. A few years earlier, another student of Otto Wagner, Josef Maria Olbrich, had a very similar intention. The white plaster facade of the Syposium building in Vienna seemed to peel off the volume that is overgrown by these gilded floral ornaments. The organic growth that is the basis, so to see, the roots really exert a pressure, so the crust of the building seemed to peel off from the body. Again, what is generally kind of misinterpreted as a pre-modern building because it's cubic, white, and so on, is a total misunderstanding, of course, because also this building is full of pressures, optical corrections, and so on, to make it alive, and not simply a kind of a cube. Plečnik introduces another element by means of the convex curvature of the windows below the cornice that make the facade more dynamic and reinforces the rolling motion. The large curve of the facade is taken up and continued by the animated secondary and tertiary patterns of the windows, the bay windows, and the granite uprights. The wooden rolling shutters that you see on the picture in the middle mark a break between the pattern surface of the granite facade and the ground floor zone, which appears in the published photographs as a dark area, as the building was photographed from above with the shutters rolled down over the shop windows. The theme that most directly quotes the formal language of textiles is located above the mezzanine windows, short curtains of copper sheeting that end in tassels. The means of tying off the threads extending beyond the woven fabric is, according to Gottfried Semper, a typical motif in the art of weaving. And Semper provided, needless to say, the theoretical basis of Otto Wagner's circle and the Wagner Schule, despite some criticism voiced by Wagner himself. The beginning of building coincides with the beginning of textiles, wrote Semper, so that meaning the essence of architecture is not construction, but the representation of the enclosed space. Through the motif of the tassels, you see it still on the slides to the left, the granite-clad surface of the facade is interpreted as a folded curtain. The term curtain wall is taken quite literally here, and the shape of the windows accentuates the folds. They create a distance clearly showing the zone under the cornice as a Faltenwurf, as a valance, to use Semper's term, and an illustration from the first volume of his book, Der Stil, which is in the middle, shows that. And I quote the comment to this image: the so-called valance mediates the contrast between upright and hanging, and as such is very important as an artistic symbol in drapery and other application, including architecture. And he adds, it is possible to think of cases where symmetry cannot be expressed and proportion and upward articulation are the only elements determining form. Such cases occur when coverings or dressings are not smooth surfaces but draperies with many folds. It is wrong to have anything in the general cut that works against the proportional relationship among the parts themselves and the whole. That is, to the thing that is veiled or dressed. The folds should fit the organism snugly, highlight its properties, and veil and correct the flaws and irresolutions in form. Antique sculpture, on the left top, you see Plečnik's early decoration from the Sophiensaal, a ballroom in Vienna. Antique sculpture and painting afford an interesting point of comparison for movable enclosures, on which the action unfurls in a scenic way, generally in front of walls. They serve in the fine arts as purely symbolic allusion to enclosed space. Many of these backgrounds consist of draperies hung with lavish folds between pillars. And Semper is mentioning here, referring to the Baroque philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and to his late essay, Principles of Nature and Grace, based on reason, in which he writes about folding as a principle of transformation and change, even when discussing the metamorphosis of animal bodies and plants. I quote Leibniz here, in their birth and death, they are only transformed, unfolded and refolded, stripped bare and recovered. A soul never leaves behind its whole body, passing to an entirely new one. So there is metamorphosis. Animals do change, but only by gaining and losing parts. In the process of nutrition, this happens continually, little by little, by tiny, imperceptible steps. It happens all at once and very perceptibly in conception or in death, which makes the animal gain or lose a great deal at once. For Leibniz, It seems folding and unfolding, masking and unmasking was a metaphor for the process of change and continuous metamorphosis. For Semper, the material aspects of folding and dressings are important. And Plečnik, with the minor details of the tassels that I have shown, and he was also interested, of course. I just took this photograph on the exhibition that goes on recently. You know how a plant form, a leaf is transformed into an object, into a kind of an arabesque with a human face. So it is, you know, the forms of the organic world changing and creating a certain kind of continuity of movement. So Plečnik tassels, to coming back to the Zachel house that I mentioned, this tiny motif of the tassels, hardly noticeable, but very important. With it, he is lifting the weight of the heavy stone envelope and creates a fleeting image, an illusion of lightness, when in reality the facade is clad with granite slabs of 33 to 80 centimeter wide and so on, with the edges covered by the cylindrical granite rods. So in the traditional sense, of course, of modern architecture, this is a lie. Because it is something is suggested that is not really materially truth. So what is the reason for this kind of architectural fiction, we can ask? The idea of metamorphosis, I have to make a little detour here to explain this concept. Came up in the thinking of Semper at the time when he was himself, you know, experiencing a historical break. He was part of it. While professor of architecture in Dresden, he took part in the revolution, you know, against the monarchy, fighting for freedom, and he directed the building of the barricades, kind of tearing up the big granite pavement in the streets of Dresden and directed the building of the barricade. The king wanted to hang him in his own theater in Dresden, so he had to go to London first and then became a professor at our school at the ETH Zurich. But again, this was this issue. You know, how to interrupt history, how to achieve change, how to get closer to something that is associated with truth. I think these were issues that were very important for many thinkers of that time. It started with a thinker who had a great influence on Semper, I assume, with Schiller, you know, the writer, who had to think about the failure of another revolution, the French Revolution, and he thought the reason of the failure was that the society was not prepared yet. And it is the so-called practical culture, the culture of the eye, the objects and so on, that would educate people and prepare them to accept historical change. I think that's an important moment, and Semper formulated such thoughts when he first visited this fantastic interior in the Crystal Palace, the great world exhibition that opened its door in May 1851 in the Crystal Palace, as I said. And most important of all was for him the so-called Caribbean hut, the reconstruction of a fisherman's hut on the island of Trinidad. The encounter with this hut must have been a confirmation for Semper regarding the origins of architecture. That again could be easily mistaken, you know, for all these kind of historic legends about the origins of architecture, the rationality of building the primitive hut. Semper was not at all interested in that. But you know, the entire space was a huge kind of curiosity cabinet, a microcosm of objects, or better, an alchemist laboratory where everything is in constant transformation. Everything is governed by certain rules, but you had machines, you had ethnographic objects, textiles, food, whatever. You know, on one hand, the new achievements of industrial civilization and capitalist production. On the other hand, you know, all these, the canoes in the Canadian pavilion and the tapestries of the South Americans, they were all together, and Semper could easily make a judgment, you know, about them. For me, entering the Plečnik house is also a kind of an alchemist laboratory. A museum of obsessions, to use the word of the exhibition maker Harald Seemann, an example of the creative process as a thinking in images, like in an alchemist laboratory again. The organic, the crystalline, and the man-made, the mechanical world are parts of this alchemy. And by alchemy, I also mean the transformation of the existing world. Again, we find here all kinds of objects for measuring, for drafting, but also pottery, watches, cuckoos, there is a cuckoo watch and so on from Switzerland probably. And this transformation happens also in his architecture, like a kind of a copper mill for grounding coffee suddenly becomes part of a sacred fixture in a church for Plečnik. So everything is able to transform, and such exciting objects are parts of this procedure. The theme of the transmutations of the created world in Plečnik's work is a kind of a theology, where transubstantiation is enacted in a process. The change of bodies in other forms, that was always part of his thinking from the very beginning. You see his drawings, partly anthropomorphic, zoomorphic forms, but also geology, plants, and so on. They all come together in different constellations. Another early work in Vienna is the Karl Borromeus fountain. And you see also here, on one hand, certainly the result of observing the natural world in the zoological garden in Vienna, for instance, that was made first of all by his colleague Josef Engelhardt, a sculptor, but also his study of historic architecture. Again, a sketch from the Italian trip, from the early Italian trip of Plečnik's in Ravenna, and this part of the Karl Borromeus fountain in Vienna. And again, these kind of fantastic creatures in the centerpiece, one could see, of his Zachel house in Vienna. Unidentifiable kind of sea monsters, plants, and so on, they all are amalgamated in a curious forms. Or much later, the Jalles Cemetery, these lightning fixtures that transmit somehow the idea of blossoming, like all these sea creatures from the very well-known book by Ernst Haeckel on the art forms of nature. Another aspect is not the organic, but the geological work. You know, the interior of the globe. If you go down in Vienna into this church, then you discover this kind of crystalline environment that reminds me on some of the illustrations in Jules Verne's book about the voyage into the center of the earth. You know, where they light the lamps and then suddenly you have all this kind of sparkling space that opens up in front of your eyes. For Plečnik, the early studies for the facade of the Zachel house was reflecting exactly that. You know, it's almost a kind of an iconography of transformation. The zone below is still a kind of an opus sectile. Then comes a more kind of crystalline, but still anorganic environment. And then it goes in further and becomes kind of blooming, blossoming, a kind of a floral kind of facade. an explanation about how it all comes together. And one aspect that is added to it is also the mechanical. You know, the machine that was so important in the architecture of Otto Wagner. But this, as a program, was already announced by the architectural magazine, Der Architekt, in which Plečnik works was frequently published. You see here on one hand historical architecture, Egypt, the issue of gravity with this form of a woman that is kind of dragged down by a big iron ball, and on the other hand, this kind of strange drawing of a crank with a hand. So again, a kind of a new synthesis of the natural and the non-natural, newly invented mechanical world. Another example, I don't want to dwell on it, the crystalline, which is, of course, not only in the case of Semper, but many other architects in the Wagner school, the plinth of the building, you know, the zone below the kind of the intellectual layer of the facade is very often you know, expressing this, the work of the hand that is related to the heaviness of geology. And I don't want to repeat myself, of course, the library here in Ljubljana is a classical example for this. Architecture and dressing are inseparable from weaving as a textile art. One of the four primitive crafts that can be found in every culture as the origin of human craftsmanship and art. With this proposition, Semper broke with the Vitruvian tradition of considering the primitive hut, Adam's house in paradise, to use the word of Rickwert, as the origin of architecture. And he pointed not to this primitive structure, but to the human mind as the place of these origins. The human desire for rhythmic repetition as an attempt to make sense of the world. So because that is important, you know, on one hand, when we are speaking, I'm just coming back, speaking about the geology and the rustication, you know, this is really the layering of heavy stones. Textile is again a different kind of gesture, a different kind of repetitive movement. Fitting together the tectonic part of the roof construction is again something that requires a different culture of the human hand. But it all comes together, and they all reflect not a real understanding. It was very clear for Semper, we cannot really understand rationally the cosmic law, but we can have a perception, and we can playfully express, you know, this kind of perception of how we see the world around us. I quote Semper to explain it. Man makes himself a tiny world in which the cosmic law is evident within strict limits, yet complete in itself and perfect in this respect. In such play, man satisfies his cosmogonic instinct. His fantasy creates these images, but displaying, expanding, and adapting to his mood the scenes of nature before him, so orderly arranged that he thinks he can discern in the single event the harmony of the whole. And it is the ritual, which is again means also the repetition of certain acts, that represents the cosmic order that the primitive man perceived. Through ritual, one expresses the law of nature, quote, as it gleams through reality in the rhythmical sequence of space and time movements. This perception, as acted out in the ritual, finds its tangible embodiment in the motifs of practical arts. It is, and I quote again, found once more in the wreath, the bed necklace, the scroll, the circular dance, and the rhythmic tone that attends it, the beat of an oar. These are the beginnings out of which music and architecture grew. So I think this is very important, what Semper called the pre-architectural conditions, out of which you can create something and use, you know, the human freedom of creation. The Caribbean hut was for Semper not a model, repeated throughout history, but an object of anthropology, a human artifact to be studied in the context of the basic gestures that I mentioned, the rhythmical repetition of notes, the fitting of timbers, and so on. And the result is not an imitation of an earlier form as a model, but a representation of these 4 basic technologies as the foundation of architectural innovation. Now I'm returning, for instance, to the motif of the carpet door in Plečnik's library. The use of marble as a curtain and showing stone as a mineral conglomerate in the case of the door. I think these can be explained also as the result of studying the rhythms of the lapping waves, the weaving of fabrics, the folds of a cloth, forces that can be recognized also on the polished surface of a conglomerate. And this kind of ritualistic understanding applies also to the use of these buildings, such a library. And Plečnik was not alone in that respect. Architects like Gunnar Asplund or Louis Kahn saw it also in this way. And I quote, you see his library in Exeter on the right-hand side. And I quote Kahn about this: "A man with a book goes to the light. A library begins that way." So again, it is not the pragmatics, you know, but it is this process of taking a book from part of the library, bringing it to the light, opening up, and so on, that was so important for Louis Kahn as well. We can see forms such as the marble curtain as an ultimate fiction of architectural masking, and therefore the denial of the truth of material. Inanimate stone is shown as light and movable by means of fictional representation. That is what another German theorist of architecture, Karl Bötticher, would call Verbildlichung, the pictorialization or figuration. But he was, I think it is quite important, he was of course, a representative of the tectonic theory, distinguishing between what he called the core form, the structurally necessary form, and the art form, a kind of a secondary layer that interprets and explains, so to say, the working of the crafts in the structure for the eye. But, you know, the consequence that was that by this distinction between core form and art form, a whole generation or even generations of architects came and said, then all this secondary layer, the art form, that is unnecessary and let's get rid of it. But the problem was, of course, that the core form in the understanding of Böttcher was not something that exists, you know, in reality as an object, but it was interpreted that way, and we had this whole, you know, modernist theory that I already mentioned of unmasking and revealing. But Semper wanted to avoid this dichotomy of the work form and art form, replacing it with the already mentioned theory of dressing, that is, replacing tectonics with figuration, that enabled him to develop the anthropological approach that I mentioned. And he went a step further, making the following shocking statement: I think that the dressing and the mask are as old as human civilization, and the joy in both is identical to the joy in those things that led men to be sculptors, architects, poets, musicians, dramatists, in short, artists. Every artistic creation, every artistic pleasure presumes a certain carnival spirit, or to express it in a modern way, the haze of the carnival candles is the true atmosphere of art. The destruction of reality, of the material, is necessary if form is to emerge as a meaningful symbol, as an autonomous human creation. Let us not forget the means that must be used to achieve a desired artistic effect, and not burst them out and woefully forget ourselves. the destruction or masking of reality signifies for Semper not an escape, but the potentialization of reality. The universal is accentuated and rendered timeless. The empirical reality of the material is destroyed, whereby material is not only the physical matter for Semper, but also can be a subject matter, a historical event. For Semper, potentialization means, like in the theater, it is not anymore a certain historical figure that who lived in a certain point of history, was killed and so on, but that's a single event that is really uninteresting for us. But if it becomes a drama on the stage, then we are suddenly, struck by it and understand the importance of this particular event. Or you can also, can compare it, what can be truthful, more truthful than a plaster cast of a face? But still, if you look at it, it is a dead form. And it is always the artistic interpretation of sculpture and so on that makes the person alive, and not the truthful plaster cast. I don't know whether these kind of analogies made sense for you, but for many architects, and first of all, of course, Semper, Plečnik, and so on, that was a deep conviction. To return to the example of the marble curtain in the library, the original woven carpet as a model was destroyed by Plečnik, and yet its form lives on monumentally. This monumentality is related not only to the permanence of the object, but also the ability of the form to recall the origins and create historical continuity. Fictionalizing the structure is necessary to enable form to become a significant symbol of the independent creativity of man. And partly because of this, political consciousness of Semper, the freedom in creation was something extremely important, and he was also critical of the Gothic tectonic, for instance, because he said that is too much constraint from the point of view of this artistic freedom. And he added that such denial of matter can only occur where the artist has complete technical mastery and knowledge of the material's property. So now we can come to a conclusion, I think. Introducing the Zachel house, I spoke about the radicality of the solution, as the building interrupts the flow of styles to make something new to appear, something that doesn't need neo-Renaissance detailing, not even the Majolica flowers of Otto Wagner. It makes no hints toward the use, toward the oriental travels of the client, Zachel, nor to the insect power that he invented and made his fortune with, of course, in other buildings designed for Zachel. That was exactly the theme, the issue of meaning, the meaning of the Oriental that corresponds with Zachel's invention of this plant that was the basis of his fortune, and so on. But instead of that, he's telling us a fiction, a tale that has nothing to do with all these elements, nor with the messy business of building with concrete, brick, stone, and mortar. The story that he's telling is an alternative, a non-Vitruvian story about what architecture really is, and he carefully avoids any reference to the underlying supporting structure, but solves the slightest details of the cladding with an extreme attention and skill, knowing that his tale about architecture can only be convincingly told with this sprezzatura, with the perfect control of all technical issues. The Semperian tale itself was never cast into building by Semper himself, and now it is the source of Plečnik's practice of architectural and material transformation. Indeed, I would even go that far to say that we appreciate today Semper theory because of Plečnik and because of Otto Wagner. If that work wouldn't exist, I think Semper would be just one of the many quite interesting architectural historians, theorists of the 19th century with no particular relevance to our architectural practice today. And that means also the truth of architecture has nothing to do with the exposed construction. You know, it is the act of masking, negation of matter, and so on. I'm repeating myself, of course, that allows the architects to use his knowledge freely, without constraints. This is a counter-proposal to architectura perennis, understood as a pure art for eternity, to architecture conceived as a survival of forms whose meaning lies so far back in the past that we can hardly remember them. This kind of torturing distance to once meaningful forms, dieses lange her, was the source of endless melancholy in the work of Aldo Rossi, for instance, that are purged of details, or Giorgio Grassi, who wrote about architecture as lingua morta, as a dead language. The difference between Rossi's and Plečnik cemeteries show the difference of attitudes to life and death very clearly. A cemetery is always a break in time. But walking in Plečnik Žale cemetery, we are not in the same city of the dead like in Modena. Modena is, but in Žale, we have a garden where all symbolic forms of the past, pagan or Christian, are resurrected as a rich and colorful tapestry of columns, arches, an architecture that pleases the eye, which is full of details, of fictions and tales, which can express this feeling of cosmic analogies that can only be acted out by colors, by forms suggesting movement. So it is not melancholy, but a feeling of joy over the richness of architecture that affirms and embraces life because it lives itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Okay, Petra is there.
Ákos, thank you very much for very, very impressive lecture. And you quote some of great Semper's statements, I think, like that architecture is potentialization of reality, for instance. What I find very relevant for contemporary thinking about architecture is this connection between metamorphism, which is seemingly continuous process. When you look at these flowers, how it seems that there's certain continuity, but you introduce a break into that. And so would you say that a break is a constitutive for architecture? And I will make a question more precise. You said that according to Semper, the origin of architecture is weaving, but is already the carpet the origin of architecture, the hanging carpet, or the break from the hanging carpet to its stoffwechsel into stone? So when it becomes already a break from this origin, but it becomes...
Yes, well, I think the second is that really I would approve, because I think this is this gesture that you also mentioned, you know, this break, that the original carpet, the different kind of ways of crafting, the different ways of working with materials that are not only relevant for architecture, but all what Semper called the practical arts. He was not too much interested in the pictorial arts, but the technical arts. This is this is not yet the monument, and the monumentality for Semper is very important. That is when an everyday object becomes part of the culture. So that is quite important, and this is the break, you know, that transforms it into this realm that is so significant in the thinking of Semper. So it is something the everyday materiality of the object. Well, has to be destroyed, of course. You can easily misunderstand it. But for Semper, it was this act destroying, in a sense of kind of transforming it into something entirely different. And the old one in itself is irrelevant, is banal, and not yet a matter of culture.
May I just 2 more things?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for this. So you said also really good for me, very support for my own thinking, that Semper is actually became recognized as relevant because of Plečnik and Otto Wagner. So you would say that based on Plečnik and Otto Wagner, you could say that Semper introduced a certain break into thinking of architecture.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Last question.
I agree with that.
Do you really need alchemy to explain architecture?
Yeah,
Can't we think about it as a material practice all the way, without any spiritual notions?
Yes, it's a good question. You know, I used the term alchemy, but alchemy would also mean, you know, in the Christian theology, the transubstantiation. You know, the Christ's blood and wine and body into bread and so on. So, in a larger sense, this is corresponding with this understanding of analogies, connections, and so on in the world, which is a kind of a non-modern, but I think very important understanding of materiality.
So you would understand that as a destruction of certain materiality and construction another materiality, and not in the sense that the architect has to have a pure soul in order to make architecture.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Then thanks, Ákos. Let me just thank you all for coming. Let me just say, well, which I forgot in the beginning, hello to all the Lina participants who are also with us here. And thank you for all 3 lecturers tonight for actually bringing 3 rather different perspectives into the ideas of that surround Plečnik's work and maybe make it still relevant today. Thank you very much. Thanks.